Hi, dialoguers. It's Laura. I'm here to talk to you today about aging voices. So, if you've ever listened to the Dialogue Doctor podcast, you've participated in any of the classes, you've done the Dash, you've probably heard me talk pretty passionately about voices for children and making sure that they sound authentic and that they're truly representing the age of the child and the way children think, not a child's voice with the way an adult thinks. And I'm obviously very excited and passionate about that. But as I've been working with authors for a while, I've realized that that specificity of aging voice doesn't just stop at childhood. Our voices continue to grow and change all the way through our life. So children have very distinct voices from teens and young adults. And then adults, both at the younger age of adulthood, middle adulthood, and into older adulthood, they all sound different and they all have different distinctions. So I thought it would be good for us to spend a little bit of time together talking about why these voices are different, how they change, and what we as authors and editors can do to capture that authenticity so that whatever story we're writing, our readers feel really connected to the characters because they feel like they're people that they know and they can connect with. So, the process for writing aging voices is the same as writing voices for any other part of your story. If you have an opportunity to, we always recommend that you plan your voices. And in planning your voices, you want to understand who your character is. You want to think about their demographics and their history and their experiences and how those things come together to create personality. Once you have the personality of your character, then you can figure out how that creates voice. When we talk about voice, we're talking about four components: body language, cadence, which is the grammar, pacing, which is when they speak, and words. And often we talk about words being broken down into topics. What are the things they talk about? And language, how do they convey the ideas? What words do they use? So that's the planning piece. Then, when you get into writing, you want to focus on drafting your story. You want to focus on the characters' experiences, their growth arc, and the plot of the story. Yes, we want you thinking about the voices as you're writing, but sometimes you can't hold everything in your head or your hands at the same time. Sometimes you have to put things down. And if you have to put voice down to ensure that you have a strong story, that's great because you always have the opportunity to edit voice when you are editing your whole story. Often I find that it's easier to edit voices in the editing process versus writing them quote unquote correctly the first time, because often we don't see where voices need to diverge from one another until we see them next to each other. In our planning, our characters may sound very different in our heads. In our writing, they may feel very different as they are coming out of our minds onto the page. But when we get into that editing process and we start reading our story the way that a reader is going to experience it, sometimes we see that there is a difference between what we expected to put on the page and what actually ends up getting on the page. And that's the beauty of editing, is that we get to make adjustments to things before we finalize them. So same process regardless of the age of your character. But as we're getting into the process, there are three things that we want to talk about characteristically that are going to help us adjust for the age of the character. That's the character themselves, and this is the character's experiences and their background. So, in the same way that the loss of a parent is going to impact someone, it's going to impact them regardless of what age they are. Their experiences of excitement or trauma are going to change who they are as a character, regardless of their age. But where this becomes important as we're talking about characteristics and how they're adjusted for age, we have to understand how old someone is when they are experiencing that life event and how much time has passed from the event to the story that you're telling. So all of those things come together in experience to create your character. Then we want to think about the season. And when you think about season, you want to think about the stage of life. No one expects for a kindergartner to be able to do the same level of math problems that a college student can do. Because we grow and we develop mentally, we also grow and we develop emotionally. And that growth that happens emotionally changes how we see the world and how we talk about the world. So, stages of life and season is a characteristic. And then we need to think about the group that we belong to, and that's generational. Excuse me. You've probably heard millennials saying things like, okay, boomer, because there are generational differences between the baby boomers and the millennials in the way they see the world, the way they experience things, the way they communicate, and the way that they talk to each other. So these are things that are important as you are building your character because the generation we come from helps to shape who we are, which means it's going to shape our voice. So, as we're thinking about our characteristics, often we focus on experience and backstory and demographic, and we focus on our character, and we don't always give season and generation enough space unless we're talking about children. When we're talking about children, we tend to spend a lot of time thinking about the stage of life, not so much the generation, but the stage of life. Now, you might be thinking, isn't the stage of life and the generation kind of the same thing? Well, yes, if you are thinking about the fact that all baby boomers are in the later stages of their life where all Gen Alphas are just at the very beginning, then yeah, it does feel like those two things are the same. But here's where those two things become really, really different and become really important in your story. And that is the timeline that you're telling your story. If you're telling a story that happens in 1960, then the teenagers in 1960 are at a different stage of life than they are when we see them now in present day 2025. So whether you're telling your whole story in a different timeline, or if you're using flashbacks, the voices of your characters, even though they're all from the same generation, are going to sound very different because of the season of their life that they are in. Make sense? Sounds good. Let's talk about how character, season, and generation affect voice. So your character, your background, your experiences, they're going to affect body language, cadence, and pacing. For the most part, they influence words too, but mostly you're going to think about them as body language, cadence, and pacing if you're adjusting for age in your voice. When you're talking about season, that's going to change the topics that someone talks about, where they're going to focus their emotional energy and their attention is based off of where they are in their life. Now, sometimes characteristics from experiences are going to trump those seasons of life. For example, someone who loses a parent very early in life and is given a lot more responsibility may progress through some of the seasons of life from a responsibility standpoint faster than their peers might. But on the other hand, emotionally, because they've lost that parent and they've had to deal with that trauma at a very young age, in other ways, they may actually be slower than their peer group. So thinking about the season of your character specifically, not just the season of life in general, is going to be really important as you're identifying how your character's voice changes as it relates to the topics that they talk about. Now, when we're talking about topics, we want to think about topics kind of in a general sense, not a specific sense. It's not like they're only going to talk about sports and they're never going to talk about medicine. That can be a part of the topics they talk about. But when we think about topics, we want to think about it just a little bit more generally. And we want to think about how they convey their ideas. Do they tend to be inclusive or exclusive with their language? So do they use a lot of we words and teamwork type words, or do they focus on me and my emotions? Or do they come from a totally different angle and they avoid talking about themselves and just talk about other people? Sometimes when we're talking about topics, we can talk about their vision. Do they focus most of their attention on the future and they just want to think about what's going to come next, forget where we are right now and where we've been? The future is where it's at. Or are they more of a rememberer? Do they think back and reminisce a lot? Do they focus the things that they talk about on historically where they've been and where their people have been? Or are they more of a right now impulsive person where they're thinking about what's happening right now? Forget about the future, forget about the past. The present is the place to be. So, those kinds of general topics can help us define a character voice. And often those things are stemming from where someone is in their season of life because of how our brains and our relationships develop. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But first, let's talk about generation. When we're looking at adjusting voices for the age of your character, you want to think about how the generation is going to change the language and the cadence of the character. It's probably no surprise to you that language changes over time. Dictionaries are constantly being updated to make sure that the newest fads in language, words like Google, being not just a noun, but also a verb, need to be part of our everyday vocabulary. The use of they, them as singular pronouns as opposed to just plural pronouns. That's another big change that's happened in language in the last 2 decades that is important because that's the way that we speak now. So these changes to our language and the words that we use come from generations and the impact of what language looked like at the time when we were creating our language patterns. Same thing goes for grammar. How were we taught grammar in school? In the silent generation and in the baby boomers generation, grammar and spelling and handwriting were drilled into you from primary school, whereas now they don't really teach handwriting anymore, and grammar has gone a little bit by the wayside because we have AI and spell check to help us with grammar. So the cadence and the grammatical usage has changed from generation to generation. So we're going to look at how all three of these things, character, season, and generation, impact the parts of our voices as we're doing our planning, our writing, and our editing. So let's just take a minute and first talk about character. Now, when we're talking about character, gave you a little bit of a preview before. We're going to dig just a little bit deeper into it now, but we're not going to go too deep because character being sorry, that was a weird phrase. Character impacting voice is the crux of what the dialogue doctor is about. Jeff created this great visual of the dialogue daisy. And if you go back to episode 25, it's a great refresher on how voice and voice modulation is created based off of your character's backstory. When we're talking about backstory, we've talked a lot about the experiences that a character has had that is creating their personality. But it's not just their experiences. We also want to think about how genetics plays a part. Someone who is born male or born female or born intersex is going to have a big impact on what their experiences are as they see the world. Race and ethnicity are going to have similar impacts, especially based off of where we live in the world. And culture plays a big role in that too. Is the culture that we live in very inclusive or is it very exclusive? Do we focus very much on family or do we focus very much on independence? Do we focus more on finances or do we focus more on experiences and education? All of these elements really play a role in creating the person we are. The person we are is our personality. Are we bold or are we shy? Are we loud or are we quiet? Are we impulsive or are we a planner? Do we look to the future or do we look to the past? Now, some of these elements are things that we talked about as it relates to stage of life and about generation, but they're also experience, culture, and genetic based. So if we look at it like a daisy, the genetics, backstory, and culture are the roots that grow into the stem of the personality, and the personality is shown to the world in this beautiful daisy that blooms, where we have the voice that has those four characteristics of words, cadence, pacing, and body language, and then modulates for the different emotions or seasons of a character's life throughout your story. So again, if you want more on the Dialogue Daisy, episode 25 is fantastic. Jeff gives us some really great examples of how the different personalities can be created based off of the different backstories and what that looks like as voices and as modulations. So I definitely recommend that you check that out. Okay, so now that we've talked about character and we are reminded about how character plays a part in voice, let's dig into the seasons and the stages of life. This is important because as we think about how we grow and develop, it changes how we see the world. So when we are very young children, 0 to 5-ish, we are focusing on the world that is right in front of us. And we are rule followers because that's the only thing we know about interacting with the world. Now, I do want to take a moment and pause right here and say there has been a lot of research on the stages of development, the stages of growth. Those are all fantastic resources. I definitely recommend if you are writing a story that has people in different stages of life and you're struggling with the voice, take a little bit of time and do a Google search or read a psychology book that talks about the stages of development. Because I do think that the more we know and the more we understand about how we grow and develop, the more authentic our voices can be because we know kind of what we're targeting. Obviously, individuals range in experiences in those developmental cycles, but the research is very sound and very well founded in here. I am using research loosely here, blended with experiences, both my own personal experiences and experiences with media through books and television and podcasts and videos on social media and such. I like this breakdown because it's pretty clean and easy to remember. You don't have to remember the difference between the development of a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old, which can be pretty significant, or the difference between a 17-year-old and a 19-year-old, which can be different, but maybe not as significant. So I just created these larger buckets that just kind of give you a good touchstone to start. If you have multiple people within one of these groups, then that's where I would recommend that you do a little bit more. Do a little bit more research to figure out exactly what is right for your story. Make sense? Okay, great. Let's jump back in. So after very young children, we've got young children, or just children, I guess, at that point, 6 to 11. And these children tend to be starting to make connections, specifically connections related to cause and effect. If I do this, then these things happen. Now, very young children, 0 to 5, absolutely, they understand cause and effect. They probably can't articulate cause and effect. But what 6 to 11 does is it shows them the variability in cause and effect. So, how more than one variable can play a part in the outcome of things. Whereas very young children, I cry, mommy or daddy or my parent or guardian comes and comforts me, is very different than if I am crying because I fall down, mommy, daddy, or my guardian are going to come take care of me. Or if I'm crying because I made a mistake, the reaction to that might be very different. So that's where the difference in the connections between very young children and the younger children is really going to come in. This making of connections makes children in that 6 to 10 range really focus on exploring their larger world. And this comes from not just the understanding that cause and effect can have multiple things, but also usually comes from bigger. Their world is getting bigger. They're having more connections. So they might have, in 0 to 5, they might have gone to daycare and they saw the same 10 children in their classroom every day. They saw their same family unit every day, and maybe they saw their extended family once in a while. But then 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, they're starting to go to elementary school where maybe they have a classroom of 20 or 30 children in a school that has multiple classrooms of 20 or 30 children, and they see different people at soccer and at t-ball and at whatever other sports or dance or singing or choir or whatever it is, right? Like they're starting to develop more interests. So their world is expanding both in terms of how they understand it and the people that they're seeing. So then in the preteen years, 12 to 15, and early teens, preteen and early teens, that's when they are starting to focus on proving themselves, and they have a tendency towards impulse control in this age range, if we're being honest about it. And this is going to play a part in voice because they're going to be using a lot of I statements here, and seeing themselves in the world as it relates to kind of a fairness. I can do that. You're not treating me like you're treating other people. I I can do it. It's just let me have the space to do it. There's some independence in that proving themselves. So that's going to impact their voice. Then as we get into the late teen and pre-adult, we're looking at 16 to 26. And again, the labels on this are soft labels that I've created. I don't know that a psychology book is going to call someone who's 25 or 26 a pre-adult. But we do know from psychology that the brain doesn't fully form until around 25. So from a standpoint of how it impacts voice, we'll go ahead and lump 16 to 26 in a place of exploration of self-expression and identity. So in the early teen years and the preteen years, there's this focus on I can do it. I should be given the same considerations as an adult. Now in this late teen pre-adult, it's that understanding of, okay, now that I'm being seen more and more as an adult and the expectations from everyone else are higher for me, who do I actually want to be in this world? So sometimes there's some trial and error there. Sometimes there's an understanding that the person I need to be in different situations needs to change. This is that voice modulation as it relates to situations where we don't talk to our friends the same way that we talk to our supervisors. Those sorts of things we're learning in those stages. Then as we get a little bit older and we look at the 27 to 40 age range, we'll call those young adults. So anyone who is approaching 40, yes, you can still call yourself a young adult. And you can point to this podcast to back that up. Anyway, this stage of life really tends to be establishing oneself. And this establishment can be as it relates to family goals, creating a long-lasting partnership, maybe with children, maybe without children. This could be financial establishment, making sure that you have enough resources financially to take care of yourself and this family that you may or may not be creating. Also, this can be establishing yourself in a workplace. It can be establishing yourself as the identity that you see yourself. Can be aspirational or it can be actual. But that 27 to 40 is now that we've figured out who we want to be in the world, how can we be really living that authentically? Then we get into that middle adulthood in our 40s up to like mid 60s. And this is where we have finally gotten to a place where we're comfortable and we're really just focusing on getting the most out of life. Sometimes we're focusing on how to get the most out of life in our retirement years, but this idea of understanding that we know who we are, we understand the world because we have a lot of experience in it. And now we just kind of want to enjoy it, and we have the space to be able to do that. And then when we get into older adulthood, 66 and above, again, loose range there, there tends to be a lot of reflection on the younger self and the earlier years. And sometimes this can result in a lack of filter. You may hear people in this age range say things like, I've earned the right to. And that's kind of this result of experience where we can reflect on the differences in the way we saw the world in our early years to now we have a more rounded out understanding of what the world looks like. So these stages of life, again, they're not written in stone. You can organize them however you want. You can break the ages down into different chunks if you want to, smaller chunks, bigger chunks, however you want to do it. But the idea is to think about the stage of life that your character is in, not just if they fall into childhood or teenagers, but this idea that as we go through our entire lives, what we're experiencing is changing because the more experiences we have, the better, hopefully, we are at handling anything new that comes along. All right, let's talk about the last section, and that's generations. We talked a little bit before about how group dynamics create generations. And generations are influenced and shaped by cultural events. That's where this kind of research came from. Now, the first time that I did any sort of real research on generations was back in, I don't know, 2012 or 2013. For my day job, I was partnering with a small business owner in Texas, and we were writing a article about the difference in the generations as it related to the workplace. It was published in a construction manual way back when. I embarrassingly don't even know the name of the journal or when it was published, but it went out into the world. But as we were writing and co-authoring this, I did a lot of research to have an understanding of how generation impacts conversation. And now, all these years later, we can use it to talk about how generation affects voice. So, also, just as a quick caveat, when I first started doing research in this area, Gen Alpha didn't even exist. So Gen Z was still the youngest generation at the time. So things absolutely do change. So starting with the oldest generation that we're going to talk about today, there are obviously generations before them, but sadly, most of those people are no longer with us. But if you are writing a period piece, definitely go back and explore the culture and the time, how people talked, how people interacted with each other in that time, so you can create a much more authentic story than just writing people from now in those times. Though, if somebody really creative wants to write a story, putting a bunch of Gen Alphas in medieval England might be pretty fun. I don't know. Maybe somebody can write that. Okay, so starting with the silent generation, again, these birth ranges are debated amongst different scholars. So if you've seen different ranges of this, that's totally okay. Even the names in some of these have changed and will continue to evolve and grow because the generations continue to evolve and grow. So the silent generation, which again, when I started doing this research, we called them traditionalists, though in all of my recent research preparing for this, I didn't find any reference to traditionalists. I did find reference to them as builders. So I don't know if you know anything about generations and you've heard traditionalists as well. Definitely drop us a comment on that because I'd like to know where that went. Anyway, so the silent generation, they were most impacted by World War II because they were born between 1928 and 1945. Their voices are going to be formal, respectful, direct, and clear. And that makes a lot of sense because they were living in a war-torn world where military rank was rule and things had to happen quickly and clearly. So yeah, that's kind of the silent generation. Then following them, we have the boomers. They were born 1946 to 64. They were highly influenced by the Cold War, Vietnam, the Civil Rights Movement, and being the children of the silent generation. So they're growing up in a post-World War II world. And obviously, these events that I'm talking about are just a small smattering of what shaped their early and their formative years. And everything that came after when they were being developed still has an impact on them. So, for example, research on the different generations, the members of the silent generation identified that they weren't just impacted by World War II, but they were impacted by World War II, the Cold War, and even things as recent as 9/11. So we have to understand that while their initial influences are based on these things, how they are still experiencing current events. They're just focusing on them through a lens of what they grew up in. So boomers also have a much more formal language, and they definitely have a much stronger grammar focus. That grammar focus actually is probably more clear than the silent generations because education was a little bit more formalized with the boomers than they were with the silent generation. Then we have Gen Xers. Um, Interestingly enough, Gen Xers are kind of the middle children of the generations, and often not so much now that Gen Z and Gen Alpha are getting much more attention, but for a long time there was kind of a fight between millennials and boomers, and lots of times when reporters were talking about it, they'd talk about the silent generation or the traditionalists, the boomers, the millennials, and the Gen Zs, and Gen Xers were left off completely. But for Gen Xers, a lot of our influences were based off of disasters. So things like the Challenger explosion, the bombings of Oklahoma City, and then Columbine, though Columbine also impacted millennials because it was a little bit later. But the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Like there was a lot there. But that was also paired with this technology, where technology was being much more introduced and much more widely populated. This and there was also, and you're going to hear this for every generation, Gen Xers were raised primarily by boomers, which also had a big impact on growth, development, and their understanding of culture. So where boomers are formal and have a very grammar focused communication, Gen Xers take a much more casual approach, but they still remain really direct, kind of like the silent generation was. Thing about Gen Xers, though, which I find actually pretty interesting, is that we have tended to carry forward our slang from the 80s. Things like literally are still being used today, whereas some of the new language that boomers brought into existence, like groovy, that kind of went by the wayside. So I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit biased because I'm definitely a Gen Xer, but that's kind of my understanding of it. So again, if you have different thoughts on it, I'd love to hear them. As we get into millennials who were born in 81 to 96, kind of the end of the millennia, they were influenced very strongly by 9/11 and social media. For those of us definitely who live in America, I can't speak for the rest of the world, but I do know that there was kind of a global impact. But 9/11 really changed a lot of things. They changed how people felt about America, how they felt about each other, how they felt about different races, religions, and ethnicities. Changed a sense of security in a lot of ways. So that definitely had an impact on millennials. But this idea of social media where everything we do can be put to the world and we can see the whole world was really a huge influence on the millennials. And of course, they were kind of the first generation to grow up with technology at their fingertips. They have their voices tend to be informal and self-focused. There's quite a bit of discussion on the interwebs about this idea that millennials using I feel language, especially as it relates to conflict and conflict resolution, which is kind of interesting. They also, because of social media, have moved to a much more grammarless or grammarless, depending on how you're looking at it, mode of communication. So that's going to impact cadence as we start talking about their voices. Then moving on to Gen Z, 97 to 2012. Again, they're still kind of young in the world. So the influence that kind of found as the most pertinent for them right now is the COVID epidemic. Their voices tend to be brief, raw, meaning emotionally raw. They also have a tendency to be very digitally focused, even in speech. I've heard Gen Zers like use acronyms from texting and emojis in conversation. So I don't know if that's all Gen Zs or a good portion of Gen Zs or just the ones that I know in my life, but something to think about. And then Alpha generation starting in 2013 through the present. Don't really have the events culturally that are going to impact them yet. So they're still kind of emerging. The one thing that we do know about their voices right now, especially as it relates to the language that they're using, is that their language is very, very rapidly changing. And that change is happening from the social media that they are, because they grew up completely engulfed in the social media world. So the language, you've probably seen the memes about Skibbity Toilet and Ohio, and all the other generations are like, what are these words? They don't mean anything. But apparently, if you're an alpha, you know what it is. So anyway, last thing I want to mention about the generations that I missed as I was talking about Gen Zers, there's some newer language, newer to me. I don't know how new it is in general, but Gen Z, where they're starting to use the word Zoomers to replace Gen Z. Millennials were Gen Ys until they became millennials. Gen Xers, well, we just decided that we're going to be casual and direct, and we're just going to remain Gen Xers for all of eternity. We're not going to adjust our language surrounding our generation's title. So I'm interested to see if Gen Z sticks with Zoomers, if they change something else. And similarly with alphas, are they going to remain alpha or are they going to check something else? The generation following alpha, they're already naming them betas. So again, remains to be seen. Hopefully we are all around to see what all that looks like. All right, so let's talk about how we use all of this new information that I just bombarded you with in our editing. So as we're doing our editing, we are going to kind of think about editing in three different phases. We are going to filter. So remember how I talked about earlier when you were writing, we just want you to write because we want the story to come out in kind of any way that it can. Well, when we're editing, we want to go back through and we want to look line by line or scene by scene and say, does this character sound like the character or does it sound like some version of me? Chances are probably pretty good that there's a lot of you in your writing. And that's great because you are the author. You should be in your story. But this is the time and the place where you want to adjust, especially if your character doesn't live in your demographic, in your stage of or season of life, or in your generation. This is when we want to start looking at it. And we want to, as we're looking at it, we want to identify what doesn't fit, starting with topics. And remember, when we talked about topics before, we were saying topic also includes perspective, like I versus we, focusing on the future, focusing on the past, those sorts of things. Once we've filtered to figure out what is and isn't working, then we want to start to translate. We want to take the season of life and we want to use it to adjust topics for perspective. So if we have someone who is talking about not doing well at an activity, if they are a teenager who feels like they constantly have to prove themselves, there might be a lot of blaming of other people. Whereas if they are in early adulthood where they've had some experiences with failure, they might understand personal responsibility and they might change their language for that perspective. And again, this isn't the end all and be all. There are lots of other things that can change that. For example, people who suffer from addiction have a tendency to see themselves as a victim in their story. And I obviously mean this with all of the respect and the love in the world because addiction is a terrible, terrible disease. But as you over and over and over fall into addiction, you create this cycle of it's not my fault because even when I try, I'm not successful. So it tends to create more of a victim mentality. And again, this is not true for everyone who suffers from addiction, but often you can see that. A great movie about that is 28 Days. Sandra Bullock. Got to give her a shout out there. I do hope at some point she listens to this podcast because I obviously talk about her all the time. But yeah, her portrayal of someone coming out of recovery, a 28-day recovery program, kind of shows that that cycle. Anyway, so you want to change. So something like that is going to trump where you are in a season of life. But in general, we want to focus on season of life being what changes the topics in our perspective. Once we have that focus down, that's when we want to start encoding. And when I'm talking about encoding, I mean we want to change the language and the cadence based on the generation. So if you have someone older, you want to focus on that much more formal language. If you have someone younger, you want to focus much more in the informality of the language and the grammar. That's where language and cadence come in based off of generation. Once you have the language and the perspective, which all fall under the category of words in our voice breakdown, then we want to start looking at body language and pacing and to some extent cadence as it relates to the character and the personality and those other elements that you've thought about as far as it goes for your character. So when you're editing, you want to filter, translate, and encode. So, okay, we've talked about the theory of this a lot. What does it actually look like in a story? So let's do an example. Let's say we have a large family visit an elderly woman who is the grandmother of this family on a hospital visit. Okay, you're writing the scene, and in your draft, you have them all walking into the room, and everyone collectively says, "Hi, Grandma," or "Hi, Grandmother. I hope you're feeling better. How are they treating you here? When was the last time you talked to the doctor?" Right? Because sometimes when we are just trying to get our scene out, we know we want to talk about a bunch of things, but we're not exactly sure what we want to say, but we need to get to the next plot point. So we just keep writing. Now we're coming back to editing. And we want to look to see what that big, long, "Hi, how are you doing? How are they treating you? How are you feeling?" And we want to break it down based off of first the season or the stage of life. So that very young child, instead of saying, "Hello, grandmother, how are you doing?" might come in and this is the first time they've seen their grandmother in a long time. And they might just say something like, "Grandma, hold me." Because again, very young children are focused solely on themselves and their understanding of the world through them being the center of the world. Grandma, hold me. Doesn't really understand where they are or why grandma's here. Just, it's about me. Younger children, 6 to 11, where they're starting to see the world and the cause and effect of it, might say something like, what's wrong? Are you going to be okay? Because they want to know what the outcome is going to be. Then when we're looking at the pre and early teens of 12 to 15, where it's about kind of impulse control and figuring out where they fit in the world as it relates to being treated like an adult, this sucks. I want you to get better. Again, this sucks is about you and me, and I want you to get better. It's about me wanting you to get better, not about you. Yes, it's about you getting better, but it's about my wants and my desires. As we're getting into the late teen and pre-adult, and we're starting to kind of balance that impetuous nature with an understanding of responsibility, then you're going to hear things like, I hate that you're here. So it's not just this sucks, but an understanding of empathy. And still, I want you to get better. As we're getting into the young adulthood, as we're starting to create establishment, I didn't mention it before, also can be just about the roles that we play in our relationships with family and friends and work and coworkers and sports teams and those sorts of things. So that might sound something like, how are you feeling? Can I get you anything? As we get into that middle adulthood of 41 to 65, as we start looking at having a better understanding of just like enjoyment of where we are, we might hear something like, you look better. What do you need? And then as we look into the older adults of 66 and above, where they have a tendency to kind of look at the past compared to right now and kind of reduce the filter, you might hear something like, you're going to beat this. Where is that doctor? So that is how we can take something that is written completely in our voice, obviously big swings here all the way around. Not everything has to be this broken down, but this kind of can show you some differences in what this can sound like as it relates to season of life. Now that we've done that, we are going to that was the translation. Now we're going to start to encode based off of language and cadence. And I'm going to do that focusing only on generation with just a smidgen of body language as it relates to character. And obviously we are not going to include pacing because pacing is the only part of voice that requires another character to be involved, because you need to pace the dialogue based off of how often one character speaks in relation to the other characters. So using that same example, we're going to take those translated statements and we are going to encode them. So the first one being, now, Grammy, Grammy, hold me, the littlest child cried, reaching up their arms. So now we've got that same focus from the child of me, me, but now we're adding the body language to that. And the body language goes to the very end because we want, and this is cadence, we want the urgency of Grammy, Grammy, hold me to be the first thing we hear. And then the littlest child can reach up their arms becomes the body language associated with it. And just to preview this for you, all of these, instead of telling you the age range up front, I'm just going to read you the quote. They are going to go in the same order of very young children, early preteens, late teens, young adults, middle-aged adults, and older adults. So the other thing about that is that I've tried to work in the age of the person into the quote just to make it a little bit easier. So moving from youngest child to the bulk of childhood, Looking around the room, the child's voice was quiet. Are you going to be okay? So again, this idea of trying to understand the world and the connections better, meaning that the child is spending a little bit more time understanding the situation. And instead of what's wrong, are you going to be okay? Just the focus on their urgency of, are you going to be okay? Then we move into preteen, and I'm going to apologize for this up front. I am not a Gen Alpha. I don't have a lot of Gen Alphas in my life. So if I am using these terms incorrectly, please don't come at me. It will be okay. Also, I'm taking a really big swing here. You might not want to go this big with your own work, but I just want to give it to you as an example. This place is skibbity, Graham. The preteen slouched in a chair, no cap. I don't know if it works or not, but again, this idea that sense of urgency of proving themselves, but still having that focus on themselves. Moving on to the next without spending too much time in Gen Alpha language. The college freshmen dropped their book bag on the chair and hugged their grandmother. You're resting up good, hearts. Again, big swing on that one using the emoji in the language. That might not work for your character, but just as an example of kind of how big the difference can be. And again, with that idea of the body language coming first to show a little bit more understanding of their place in the world, as opposed to the preteen who just comes in and starts talking right away. Moving on. I'm sad you got to be here, the 30-year-old said, stroking their grandmother's hand. Are they at least streaming something good up in here for you? Again, this idea of this generation being very focused on technology and social media, both as a distraction and as part of life. And again, some of the informality in the language, in the I'm sad you got to be here, and something good up in here for you. Again, very informal in the language. Moving on to, you look good, better. When'd you eat last? Can I get you something? The 50-year-old said and fussed around their mother's hospital room. So again, this idea of focusing on kind of the enjoyment and comfort in life and being very comfortable in their role. In this case, they understand in this role, they are the caregiver, even though it is their mother, who in their younger years was presumably the caregiver. So, and then finally moving on to the oldest adult. How do you expect anyone to, or excuse me, how do they expect anyone to get better in this place? They stick you in this room all alone with all these machines. It doesn't make any sense, the older person said. And again, that's this reflection on the world and its state and how it used to be versus how it is now, with a little bit of lack of filter. So I just hope those examples kind of help you see not just the variety that can be in our dialogue, but also the process from filter to translate to encode, using language, body language, cadence, and ideally pacing at some point, with language and topics all being part of words. So hope that helps. The last thing that I want to do before we wrap up is just give you a recap. If your characters are different ages in your story and you want to account for that, that's great. You can absolutely include that in your planning, but get your story on the page first, just like you would for any other characters, because let's face it, if you don't have anything on the page, it's very hard to get stuff on the page. And we don't want to put up any barriers to you getting your story out of your head and in a format that somebody else can absorb. So write your story first and then be prepared to adjust topically for stages of life first, and then encode for generation as necessary. I hope you found this helpful. As I said a couple of times throughout, go ahead and leave any comments you have in the thing below, I guess. I don't really know how technology works. I'm not a very good Gen Xer. Anyway, thanks for listening. Hope you made it this far. Have a great day.